Well, I think we've got most people here now, so I'm going to make a start. For those that don't know me, I am Stephanie Perroton, currently the Vice President of Birmingham Law Society. And we decided to put together this session today for anyone who is looking perhaps for a career move, to boost your profile on LinkedIn, or just get some hints and tips in terms of what you should be looking at and what you should be thinking about. I'm delighted that we're joined by James, Darren and Danny from Taylor Root. Taylor Root were established in 1989, and I think it's fair to say they're one of the forefront runners of legal recruitment. The longevity has enabled them to build an extensive platform and become an established leader in their field. They operate from multiple offices around the world. So as well as offices in Birmingham and London, they're in Dublin, Amsterdam, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt, Milan, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Melbourne, Sydney and New York. So if any of you fancy a move to a different jurisdiction, I'm sure they can help you. They recruit for all types of opportunities within private practice, including at all levels, partners, associate level hires for international, national and regional law firms. In addition to fee earning opportunities, they also specialise in securing roles for professional support lawyers, knowledge management lawyers and paralegals. So I'm joined today by Darren Hale. Darren's a partner in the private practice team. He's a qualified solicitor, having trained with Clifford Chance, qualifying in 1996. He specialises in recruiting solicitors and partners into private practice, mainly in the London area. Second person I'm joined by is James Brewster, who joined Taylor Root in September 2019 as Group Manager for the Birmingham office. He specialises in recruiting solicitors and partners into private practice around the Midlands. And finally, Danny Rastelli is an experienced marketing professional. He's Taylor Root's Global Marketing Manager and has worked with some of the UK's biggest brands as well as startup ventures in recruitment, finance, entertainment, retail, construction and non-profit sectors. And guess what? He's going to be giving us the hints and tips on LinkedIn. So before we go any further, I'm going to pass over to Darren Hale, who's going to give us an overview of the market. I'm not sure where you're going to start with the current restrictions that we've got, but Darren, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hi, I'm Darren. I thought it would be good just to give everybody a bit of an overview as to what the market looks like at the moment. I think that we are in all aspects of our lives in uncharted territory, and the recruitment market doesn't really differ from so many other aspects of our life. I think certainly when lockdown hit in March, I think there was a very rapid paralysis of the market, and we had a few weeks where literally there wasn't any recruitment going on, with a couple of notable exceptions. Everything sort of went on hold for a few weeks. I think that certainly since that initial sort of the first 4 or 5 weeks, since that period, we've seen sort of a slow thawing of that paralysis, and I think we are most definitely into sort of a recovery phase. And I suppose a bit like the pandemic, you just can't really get hold of it. It's like trying to grab hold of a jelly. You just can't get to grips with exactly sort of what the future is going to look like. But certainly we track our sort of numbers of vacancies on a week by week basis, and what we've seen both across Birmingham but also nationally but also internationally, the numbers of roles within the law firms has been creeping up, but we're still sort of looking at a market which is probably operating at 60% of the capacity that we had tail end of last year, when no one had even heard of Wuhan. So there is still sort of a fair degree of pain in the market. What we're seeing is, and it's something that I sort of saw sort of post 2008 2009 GFC, is that there's always recruitment going on in law firms. There's always opportunities. Lawyers go off on maternity leave and don't return. They go in-house. They decide that actually they don't want to be lawyers anymore, and they go off and do something else. So there are always opportunities. I suppose what we're seeing at the moment is there isn't that much opportunistic or strategic recruitment going on at associate level. Most of the recruitment that's happening is recruit to replace. So there has to be, in the vast majority of situations, a reason why the firm is coming to market to hire. And what we have seen though is that strategic partner recruitment has carried on after that initial phase of paralysis. I think that we are still placing partners both again in Birmingham but also in London. So firms have very quickly become more comfortable with this concept of maybe having limited face-to-face exposure, but the vast majority of recruitment process, even at senior partner level, being done via Zoom. So ultimately, we are seeing a slow improvement. I mean, what we don't know is, well, what the next few weeks between now and Christmas looks like. Quite whether there will be some kind of, there will be sort of some kind of limited lockdown. Whether it is going to be very much region to region, nobody knows. And I suppose that there is a chance that we take a few steps backwards to then take us to a few steps forward in the new year. But I think certainly, what we have seen and what we were encouraged by is that. There are increasing numbers of roles, and actually roles coming up in transactional areas, which perhaps we wouldn't necessarily have expected at this point in the slow, cautious recovery.
Thank you. So apart from the transactional work, are there any particular practice areas that have remained busy or have improved quicker than others?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a theme, and it's a theme that we see again and again, sort of during a recession, and we are in recession, aren't we, technically now? But this has been sort of a very sudden sort of realignment of the market. But the market has responded in the same way as it always does, in that it's always the contentious areas. So contentious litigation, obviously, but contentious construction, contentious property matters, so property litigation. Those kind of areas have been really, really busy. And what we've seen is, the firms really building up, particularly their litigation departments. We have also seen employment be really busy. I think initially, sort of when the furlough scheme came into play, lots of clients wanted guidance as to how they how they navigate the path of the furlough scheme. And I think now that furlough is coming to the end, is in sight. Unfortunately, clients are sort of working around sort of what that means from a resource planning perspective, and so we are seeing lots of opportunities for employment lawyers, and also lots of opportunities for employment lawyers on a contract basis as well. So firms not necessarily wanting to swell numbers on a permanent basis, but seeing a real sort of expansion of need for expertise in that area, and so looking to fill on a contract basis. The areas where we've been quite surprised has been real estate. Birmingham obviously has a very large real estate market within the Birmingham firms, and we have seen across a number of levels actually real estate roles. So it's hard to work out whether that is recruit to replace, or whether ultimately there are other factors in play. Real estate assets are changing, office uses are changing. So I think that's probably triggering the pension funds and the guys that own those buildings to actually sort of reassess what the future looks like, and there are sort of big transactions going ahead.
Thank you. And given that you're based in London, and most of us are still working from home, do you think the working from home model will open up opportunities for Midlands-based lawyers to work for perhaps London city firms?
I think it's too early to give sort of 100% answer to that. I think that we're yet to see sort of roles where firms are comfortable with hiring a lawyer who's going to be virtual 100% of the time. Obviously, most lawyers aren't in their offices, if at all, but certainly not very much at the moment. But I think it may well open up opportunities. I mean, the firms are increasingly being flexible. Some of them have been very vocal in putting out what their plans look like for the future in working from home, at least 2 days a week. And if you are a Birmingham-based lawyer who wants to work for a London-based firm, then providing that you're able to get to the city for face-to-face days, 2-3 times a week, then obviously that potentially opens up opportunities that didn't exist before. So we haven't seen what that realignment of the market might be and what it means in salaries and all those sorts of things. But I think that looking at how quickly things have changed, I think that the market could look very, very different in the short to medium term.
Thank you, Darren. Moving over to James now, who is going to cover CVs and interview advice. First of all, the $60 million question, James. What information should solicitors include on their CV? I know that the format has changed since the days that I completed a CV many, many years ago when I almost wrote an essay. What format are people using these days?
Hi everyone. I think generally speaking, it's not so much about the format. I think what people should probably concentrate on is maximising the CV's communicative strength. So after all, your CV is the initial chance to make an impression. So that hasn't changed over all the years. But generally speaking, simplicity is crucial. And we would always probably recommend that you present your CV content in 4 very clear sections. So number 1 being personal details and education. Number 2, your legal experience. So you list your employment in chronological order along with the date. So from when you joined to when you left. And then examples of the cases you've handled, the kind of clients you've worked with, the level of responsibility for those matters. Number 3, relevant non-legal experience. Obviously, it gives the person who's reading your CV an idea about what you do. And then finally, number 4, interests. But it might be that you enjoy playing football or netball or mountain climbing, whatever it might be. It gives an insight into your personality, which is very important. But keeping it relevant is probably the most important thing. And I would highly recommend that listing your experience in sort of bullet point form will help with that, sort of keep it nice and concise. A lot of questions we get around sort of, well, how long should it be? I think probably 3 pages is probably the maximum for a push. But again, there's no written rules to this. This is just what we find works the best. You don't need to write pages and pages of information. And as I say, keeping it relatively short and concise and very relevant to the probably the key things here.
I would totally agree with that. Having sat on our legal recruitment panel for many, many years, the longer the CV, the more you get totally fed up towards the end of it. Yeah. Common mistakes. I know in my experience, a number of CVs have general themes running through them, which are common mistakes. You must see far more than I do. Is there anything in particular you would suggest people avoid?
Well, I'll start on the other side in terms of, I think the common mistake actually is, it depends on confidentiality and the level of experience, but when people don't include the cases that they've handled and the level of responsibility, I think that, because ultimately those are the key things that are going to get you the interview. So it's very key to highlight client activities that showcase your expertise. And so sometimes people think, well, it's confidential, I can't mention that, or it's just too much information. Well, actually, when we talk about being concise, those are the things that are very key to it. So I think other mistakes people make sort of linked to that, not including commitment to business development and marketing activity. These things are really important. So thinking about the times when you've promoted your existing firm or maybe a former firm through marketing events such as breakfast meetings and seminars, all more virtual at the moment, but it wasn't that long ago we were meeting in person at these kind of events. And I think this is the final point I would say, is that not critically reviewing your CV content. So when you've drafted it, ask yourself, is it relevant to the job vacancy that I'm applying to? And it's perfectly okay to have more than one version of your CV. And in fact, we advise to tweak the content to make it relevant to one particular application. So and that's perfectly acceptable. I would also advise against over-egging the pudding. Keep it factual. Don't embellish the truth, because whilst it might get the interview, and that's fabulous, things will quickly unravel at interview because it will become clear that you're trying to mislead the interviewer, which is never good. Final point. No selfies or fancy font. Keep it formal. And after all, it's a formal document.
Thank you. I remember one CV many, many years ago where the applicant had said that she'd auditioned for X Factor, And it was one of those interviews that dried up very, very quickly. So I thought, well, I'm going to ask the question. And she actually gave us a song during the interview. So it was probably worth putting that on. But anyway, with interviews, how would you advise somebody to prepare for an interview? And actually, just before you answer that, I know everybody listening is on mute, but if you do have any particular questions as we're going through things, feel free to use them in the chat button and I will then direct them to the relevant speaker. So if there's anything you think we've missed out or you really want to know, please use the chat facility, and the bottom, the button for that is at the bottom, mark chat, which I'm sure you've all found over the last few months. Sorry, James. Common questions for interviews and preparation for interviews.
Yeah, yeah, because it's a bit, you're going into the unknown a little bit, aren't you? So they are tricky things and certainly not easy. But we do find the more interviews you go to, the better you get at them. I think one of the best ways to prepare for interviews is actually to think about what you're going to ask. So you're in control of that, and remaining in control of what you can control is the best thing. So asking the right questions at an interview is key. And after all, it's a two-way process. So preparing and asking your own questions is necessary for two reasons. It helps build rapport with the people that you're meeting, but also critically, deciding whether you want to actually work for that firm. So in order to build rapport with the person sat on the opposite side of the table or screen, as it were, you need to try, if you can, to treat the experience as more of a conversation. So, for example, it's okay to interject as the interview progresses rather than saving all your questions to the end. Obviously, I'm not recommending that you interrupt the flow of the interview and put in, but listening to seeing, assessing the situation and making sure your questions are timely. It reveals your ability to partake in a balanced conversation, but also having an opinion on things is quite compelling. I find that sometimes lawyers, at whatever level, think that the interviewer holds all the power. But it's a very important need for you to vet the person or firm that you want to go and work for. So it's critical, and it might be that you're lucky enough not just to have one offer, you might have two or more job offers. So picking the right one will depend on the kind of questions you've asked. And after all, everyone has varying wants and needs in relation to their career. So it might be that the person you're interviewing skips loads of information, but the information is critical to your decision. So it's very important that you've prepared well, and you genuinely want to know answers to these questions. So I would recommend be clear on what you want, think about the future, think about training and progression and sort of what opportunity there is to grow within the law firm. So and ask specific questions about the law firm's training and routes for progression and sort of where the business is headed. And as we've alluded to, very unprecedented firms are heading in very different directions, so it's more prevalent than ever to ask that sort of question, I think.
I would totally agree with that, and I think what you've said is exactly my experience, is not to just do a quick Google of a firm's website before you go for the interview. It's actually the times we get quoted back to us things that are on our own website, or just a quick question from the sort of the top 6 things that are on the website. It's actually people need to think a little bit more about what it is they want and where it is they're going. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of challenges at the moment, aren't there? And I think right now, how firms are dealing with COVID is key. And also, one really important question is to sort of see how your output is going to be measured. So particularly now, it's more important than ever because firms are managing people who are working remotely. So how do they manage output? And then how are you going to be supported if you're not physically sat next to the partner that's supervising your work? These are really, really good questions to ask now. And if you're not asking them, it sort of begs a question, really.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Obviously, a lot of interviews, well, probably most interviews at least, are taking place remotely at the moment. Are there any particular tips that you would give somebody who is actually attending a Zoom or a webinar or whatever interview format people are using? Because it is very different to being on screen to being with somebody in a room. Is there anything in particular that you would suggest or how applicants can prepare for that?
Yeah, I think in general terms, the preparation is much the same. But I would think about a couple of things that maybe people don't think about necessarily. I think it's very important to make sure that your IT setup works in a virtual interview. I certainly recommend logging on in good time to make sure that you've got no issues. And also be mindful of the way, I'm not saying I'm perfect, obviously, but the way that you present on a video is quite different to how you might present in person. So, like, for instance, you don't get the chance to have a good handshake, but actually your appearance and how you look is still very important. So, you know, wear a good shirt or blouse. You can obviously get wearing pajama bottoms these days, as long as you don't get up and walk around, you're going to be fine. But I think more generally, I think some virtual or in person, a couple of things that I would say are very important. Don't drag out the interview unnecessarily, keeping a good flow, being self-aware to judge how the meeting is progressing. If it's going well, you'll get a good feel for it. And I think, as I've said, not taking the time to prepare, not doing your research, not being clear on what's important to you are specific no-nos. Try not to ask more questions than the interviewer. So you're grilling them. It's important to have questions, but don't over-egg the pudding. And don't be tempted to ask questions just for the sake of demonstrating the research you've done, or trying to look smart. An interviewer will see right through it. I think you failed attempt to look clever. So you do need to come across as genuine. And as I said before, I think a common mistake is feeling that candidates feel that the interviewer holds all the power. They don't. It's very much a two-way process.
And just very quickly before we move on, I think sometimes people move within firms to different roles, particularly trainees who are looking to qualify. Is there a big difference between an internal and an external interview, or should you treat them in exactly the same way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, by definition, they are different, obviously, but actually very similar in terms of the way that we would recommend you prepare. I think if you're a trainee at the firm or you're moving from one team to another, I think never think that it's in the bag because you are, an internal person, employee of the firm. Obviously, some of the things that I've covered won't apply because you probably work there, but it might be that you don't know the head of that team, and equally they don't know you either. So treat it as you would any other external meeting. But what I would add is that a couple of things in your favour. Culture fit. I mean, that's a massively important thing with any interview. And if you're already working with the firm, you've got that, or should have that in abundance. And a lot of hiring decisions are based on culture fit. And also, from a hiring manager's point of view, to recruit somebody internally, works a lot better some of the time because there's less downtime. As an internal person, you already know how to use the case management system, you have an understanding of certain processes and procedures. So again, that's in your favour. But so very much so, if it's an internal team, you've got the opportunity to move to another team for whatever reason, don't let yourself down. Don't be too laid back about it. Sell the fact that you already work for the firm, definitely. And that you don't want to leave and you would much rather stay and further your career there. Don't assume that they know that already. Make a point of demonstrating that.
Thank you. And just before we move on to Danny, I've got a question for Darren. In general, what does London hiring landscape look like for regional NQs or one-year PQE? And how common is it for London-based firms to hire at a junior level from the regions?
I think the answer to that is very different for NQs compared to 1 years. I think all of the London firms are struggling to find homes for their own internal trainees. And so the general message is that the NQ market in London doesn't look great this year, or moving into the spring, for London-based or Birmingham-based trainees. I mean, there are sometimes pockets of opportunity, you know, where we will still see roles is areas, sort of niche areas like, I don't know, pensions or places like that, where there isn't a trainee at a firm that wants to qualify into that practice area. And then if the firms do come to market, they actually view the Birmingham or regional based trainees very favourably. I think that they think that the regional trainees tend to get probably better hands-on experience than some of their city counterparts. And so, you know, in a normal market, and if roles come through, then yeah, definitely CVs would be looked at favourably. But as a general rule, I can't anticipate that, you know, in the mainstream practice areas, there will be new NQ opportunities for people to be able to relocate from Birmingham to London. 1 year, slightly different. I think at 1 year, firms are recruiting for experience, whereas at NQ, they're recruiting still very much for potential. And so that as a 1 year lawyer, yeah, there are pockets of opportunities. But, you know, I go back to what I said earlier. We're operating in a market that's probably at about 60%. So invariably, roles at that level are down 40% as well.
Thank you. And finally, we come to Danny, who's going to touch upon LinkedIn profile and networking. I think it's probably fair to say that we've all used LinkedIn a lot more over the last 6 months than perhaps we had before, or maybe I'm just too old to have been using it properly before. What are the most important things that candidates need to consider when they're creating or even enhancing their LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to remember is that LinkedIn is so much more than just a job website. It can often be seen as, I mean, the amount of conversations that I've had, for example, with people where I've asked them, why is your LinkedIn profile so out of date? And the answer is quite consistently that, oh, I'm not looking for a job, or I don't want my employer to think I'm looking for a job. But actually, LinkedIn is so much more than that. Yeah. Your profile is essentially your business card. It's a professional impression that recruiters see of you, and that employers see of you. So I think it also demonstrates credibility in your industry. It highlights your achievements, and it also kind of showcases you as a person and a professional to your peers and to your potential clients. So I think from a job perspective, I think it was early last year, LinkedIn commissioned a survey, and 93% of recruiters said that their first port of call is LinkedIn when they're looking for candidates. So I think it's incredibly important that someone who is looking for a new role think about the way that they're positioning themselves in LinkedIn and within their network. And it can also be, to James's point earlier, a very valuable enhancement to a CV, because you can add to LinkedIn the level of detail that perhaps you wouldn't add to a CV, because you don't want to have a 6-7 page CV. So using LinkedIn as a complement to that, I think, is very, very important. And I think to that point, the important things to consider when building your profile is stuff like choosing the right profile picture. Make sure it's professional, make sure it's up to date.
That was going to be my question, because that is my biggest bugbear, is the photographs on LinkedIn. Some of them, if you are looking if you are using LinkedIn for a job position, some of the photographs on there are, to be honest, wholly inappropriate for, and I'd look at some of them and think, I wouldn't even go there. So I'm glad you mentioned photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. Photographs, make sure that your headline is more than just your job title. The headline on your profile is probably the second thing that people will see after your photo, so make it count. Request recommendations, that's a huge thing. I mean, in an era where we wouldn't hire a service without looking on Trustpilot, we wouldn't go on a holiday without looking at TripAdvisor, we wouldn't join a business without looking at Glassdoor. Recruiters will prefer someone who has recommendations from their peers and their bosses over someone who doesn't have that, because essentially, if you don't have recommendations, it's just your word for it, and they have to trust that.
Danny, is that true at all levels in terms of recommendations, sort of junior all the way through to senior?
Absolutely. You're never too senior to have recommendations from your peer group. I think it's very valuable because it showcases that you're not only you're basically putting your money where your mouth is, and you're allowing people to recommend you because you've done a good job, and you have grown within your industry to a level that people recognize, and certainly recommendations are very, very important, along with, for example, writing content. So content is huge when it comes to LinkedIn. If you want to be seen as someone who is credible, who knows what they're doing and knows their industry, the best way to do that is to showcase it through writing articles and thought leadership.
Which brings me very nicely onto common mistakes for posting. I know I have to go back to my guys every time I do a post to say, is it a hashtag or is it an at, or what do I do with this? So there are clearly, as you look through LinkedIn, common mistakes, but are there one or two that you could just mention for everybody on the call? Yeah,
absolutely. So the biggest mistake you can make is creating a profile and not updating it. I think what essentially will happen is if you create a profile and you leave it because you feel you don't need it, when you then do need it, you're going to have a profile that has no recommendations, you're going to have a profile that has no network, that has no thought leadership to draw on. So you're essentially going to be left with a tool that could have been very valuable to you, but that, alas, is not. I think having old profile photos, unprofessional photos, even worse, no photo at all, that's a huge no-no, because people hire people, and if they can't see that person, I think that is definitely to your detriment. So it's important that you have a professional photo, it's up to date, it's current, people know who they're looking at when they're looking at your profile. And I think that another common mistake is not having a high level of detail in your profile. I think you need to have as much detail as possible. Detail is your friend when it comes to that kind of thing.
Thank you.